record right now. Okay, well, welcome to our garden Zoom. And this is Delisa Renadeo, and the date is April 3rd, 2021. And I live in Alaska, and we are looking forward to a garden season, which is kind of late getting started because we still have about a foot of snow on the ground. But we have a lot of sunlight, so it's going to be melting pretty fast. At least I'm counting on that. So today I'm going to be sharing ideas about how to get started with your garden with a variety of different circumstances. Some of you may be planting your very first garden, which is great. I love helping people get started. And I think it's always a good idea to start small so that it's not too overwhelming, and you can always expand that later. And it's also going to be for people who have gardened before, but you're really trying to improve your garden. And improving your garden usually means improving your soil, because you can't have a good garden without good soil. And that's something that we're becoming increasingly aware of in our world today, because we have been ruining the soil through a lot of different ways that we didn't know we were ruining it. So anyway, I'm going to be explaining a little bit about how to get started and doing things that will help your soil while you're gardening. And then different configurations, whether you're gardening in like a box, a raised bed box, or just a mounded raised bed, or just out in the garden where you've just got a big plot of land that you have gardened in. So I'm going to talk about each one of those. But first I have to show you my shirt. I just want to work in my garden, and there's Heidi, and hang out with my dog. My very good friend gave me this shirt, and so I like to wear the right shirt to go with the right topic here, and the topic is gardens. So let's just talk about the difference between planting in a container versus planting in the ground. When I say a container, I'm talking about something that is separated from the ground. So even if you have a raised bed out and it's got a box around it, I mean, that's kind of a container, but it's not closed on the bottom. So there's a difference. If it's in a container that's separated from the ground, then it can't get the nutrients and the soil life that is in the ground. And that doesn't mean that you can't grow good, vegetables and flowers. You can still grow good vegetables and flowers. I have lots of pots that I grow in. And, but we have to treat that gardening situation quite differently from when we're planting out in the ground. And in the ground, it doesn't matter whether it's, in a box sitting on the ground or whether it's just, a plot of land. So let me talk about containers specifically first. If you're planting in a container, and this doesn't matter whether it's flowers or vegetables, that container can get very compacted. The soil in the container can get very compacted because it just can't, there's no circulation of earthworms coming in and out and everything. So we need to use a potting mix that is very loose, because the plant roots need to have oxygen, air flows through, and the water needs to flow through. And if you've got kind of a real brick-like soil in that pot, it's not going to do well. So you do not want to use regular garden soil in a pot. So even if you have an outdoor garden and you say, oh, look, it's full of dirt, I'm just going to shovel that into my pot. Don't do it that way. That won't give you good results. So you actually need to have a potting mix. It's called a potting mix. And so you can go to the store. They sell them at Home Depot and Lowe's and garden supply stores, and buy a potting mix. And the potting mix is going to probably have some peat moss and or coconut coir and maybe something like perlite or vermiculite, which are natural substances that are created out of some minerals and then kind of puffed up like Rice Krispies or something. They puff up this mineral, which when I first saw it, I thought they were putting styrofoam in the soil because it kind of looked like that. I thought, why would they put styrofoam out here? But it's not. It's made from minerals. But the perlite helps to not only loosen the soil mix, you can put it out in the outside garden as well as in a pot. But anyway, it helps to loosen the soil, and vermiculite also does, and the vermiculite also absorbs more water. So you need a potting mix. Now you can make your own potting mix, but you don't need to. One brand that I have used a lot is called Pro Mix, and it's not the only one. You can certainly do that. And if you want to make your own, you can do that, but you don't need to. And if you're just getting started, I don't recommend that you put that onto yourself. Okay, so that's the beginning part. But now the other part of that is, while those plants are in the container, they're not going to have access to the nutrients that are out there in the soil. And they're not going to have access to all the microbes and earthworms and all of that that are out there that are bringing nutrients into your root area. So that means you have to feed your plants in the pots. These are all mistakes that I've made personally, by the way. I've put, garden soil in pots, didn't work well. I've not fed my pots, that didn't work well. So you need to feed the soil in the pots, and they will grow. I mean, there will be microbes in there, which is good. We need those little microorganisms, and they can have their whole world life in there, but they're not going to have access to whatever's outside of the pot. So they're in a small world, relatively speaking. So you're going to need to have some good way to feed your microbes in the pots. So number one, you need a potting mix. Number two, you need some food. And there are different ways to get this. Now, the old-fashioned way, well, not the very old-fashioned, but in my lifetime, a lot of people just poured, Miracle Grow or some kind of, chemical fertilizer on them. But there are better ways to do it. We can put in, I have worm bins now, and so I'm going to put in some worm compost. And you don't want to put in a lot of compost because the compost is going to start to compact it more. So I wouldn't put in more than maybe 30% of compost. But the compost would be a good thing to add to your potting mix because it does have soil life in it, as it has organic matter that the little microbes can break down. So that's a good thing to put in with your potting mix. So when you're first putting your pot together, you can add some compost. Now, if you don't have if you're not making your own compost, which you probably aren't if you're a beginning gardener, you can buy some compost, and they do sell this. There's a lot of things. Compost is a generic term in a lot of ways. And if you go to Home Depot or something, you may see some stuff that you think is compost because it says that, but I don't recommend it. But there is something I do recommend, and that is Susitna Organics sells compost, and they're located out in the Matanuska Valley near where I live, but they make a very high quality compost, and it's a local compost. So if you're watching this and you don't live in Alaska, then this is obviously not information for you. But if you do live around here, you can get it from them, but you don't have to come out to, if you live in Anchorage or someplace else far away, you can buy this in bags, and they do sell it at Alaska Mill and Feed and the, what is it called? The Garden Supply Center. Southside Garden Supply, I think it's called. And so they sell it in like a 20 pound or 20 quart bag. And if you need a lot of compost, um, which you wouldn't if you have pots, but if you have a bigger garden area, you can actually order it to have them deliver it by the truckload if you're putting in a huge garden. But anyway, it's high quality compost. So, but don't just use compost in a pot just by itself. Have it as no more than 30%. And it could be definitely less than that. You know, you could just put in, you know, maybe, I don't know how big your pot would be, but you could just put in maybe a quart of it. But that's a good thing to put in. And then throughout the summer, as the plants grow, you're going to want to feed it some more. And so you could add a little more compost just on the top, but you know, your pot's going to probably be full and you won't be able to put a lot more on. So you can put some liquid food on there. And one thing is you can buy some kelp. It's a liquid kelp, and you can buy this at a garden supply store. And you just need a little bit of it. And just to dilute, put some in some water and pour that onto your plant. You might also want to use some rock dust, which you can actually get that from just like a gravel pit. And if they're making gravel there, they probably have some rock dust from making their gravel, and just any old rocks, but having it all ground up and adding a little of that, because that's going to add some minerals to your soil. But if you don't have the rock dust and you don't want to go find it, you can buy something called azomite, 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 and that is a mixture. It's comes in a box, and they'll sell that at a garden store, and that is minerals. And so you could add a small amount of that, and you just read on the, it's not a specific recipe, but just kind of sprinkle that in, and that'll add some extra minerals. So the main thing is with your pots that you want to fill them up with a very loose, airy material, and so that they don't become too compacted. And then they need to be put out in a sunny area. But depending on what you're growing, you may need, you know, more sun or less sun. So, you know, there are some things that can tolerate, you know, less sun. But if it says full sun on a package, that means a minimum of 6 hours. So full sun doesn't mean 24 hours a day, but it has to be at least 6 hours of sun. So that's for pots. And it doesn't really matter if it's a small pot or a big pot. It doesn't really matter if it's a vegetable or a flower. You're going to need that kind of a loose potting mix. Now let's talk about the, if you already have an existing raised bed out in your yard, then you probably, if it's an existing one, you have something in it already. And in order to refresh it, you don't want to till it. That's one of the things that harms the soil. It loosens it up at first, but then it actually creates more compaction in the long run, and it's destroying a lot of the microbes in there, especially the fungal part, because the mycelium, the fungal hyphae are going out, and when you till it, you're just chopping it up and killing all the soil life. And so we don't want to do that. It doesn't kill the bacteria, but we want the bacteria and the fungi to be in a balance. So it's best to not till it. There are some exceptions to that. If you have compacted soil that, I mean, you just can't get a fork into, pitchfork, you may need to till it one last time, but then never again, but just in order to till some organic material into it. And then, but in general, we want to avoid disturbing the soil too much. Now we do have to disturb it when we are going to plant, but we want to disturb it the least amount possible. So if you've got an existing garden, whether it's in a raised bed or it's out in a garden bed, you can just poke a fork, like a pitchfork, although there's other kinds that have a wider, like more of a blade, and just poke it down straight into the soil and then kind of rock it back and forth and that allows air to get into it and water to penetrate. And you can, I just ordered a broad fork, which it's got 12-inch tines on it, and it's wider. It's like 20 inches wide. I don't have it yet, or I'd show it to you. But poking that down into the soil and then rocking it back and forth loosens it without causing the tremendous damage to the soil life that you get if it's just churning like that. And you also don't want to just take shovels of it and, flip it over and turn it upside down, because imagine if somebody did that to you in your house and they said, oh, I'm just gonna I'm just gonna shake things up a little bit, and they pick up your house and dump it upside down. It's like that'd be extremely disruptive. So we don't want to do that. Now, we don't really want somebody poking holes through our roof and loosening it like that, but that's kind of like the earthquakes that we have. It kind of trembles, but then it settles down and we're all okay. And so that's a good idea to actually do, to aerate your soil, unless it's already so loose that you don't need to do that. But if you do, then you have like really great soil. So loosening it up this way is a great idea. Adding some more compost to the top of your soil is a good idea. So again, we're talking about an existing garden bed. So you could add an inch, half an inch, 2 inches. I mean, if you have good quality topsoil, adding that to the top is a really good idea, because you're going to add soil life that's in the compost, and you're also going to add the organic matter that's in the compost. So those are both good things. The soil life is you're going to say, well, it's just sitting on the top. What good is that going to do? The soil life is going to begin incorporating that down, and the little earthworms are going to come up and they're going to grab some and bring it down. And so they're going to mix that for you, but they mix it in a much nicer way than your tiller does. So that's the better way to get extra compost and soil life into your garden, is with the compost. Now, we need to continue to think about covering the soil. We don't want to leave bare soil. Bare soil is it causes compaction. It causes the soil to dry out. It causes the death of soil life, and it invites weeds to come in, because nature does not leave soil bare. The first thing nature is going to do is try to bring in weeds to cover that area. If you take a walk out in the woods or out in some natural setting, you're never going to see bare soil. Nature doesn't do that. So we need to learn from nature, and we need to keep our soil covered. Now, I didn't mention that with the pots, because with the pots, usually there's not much room for bare soil, because the leaves are going to, cover up the soil. You're not going to see bare soil. You could still cover it when you're first planting. If you've got some extra space, you could cover that with leaves or something, but that's called mulching. Mulching is when you put something over the top of the soil. And so using some kind of an organic mulch is a really good idea. It can be leaves, it can be old straw or hay. So it can even be newspaper or cardboard. So those are all things that you can put on top. Now, I don't really like the looks of newspaper and cardboard, but it's actually a pretty good mulch, because the soil microbes like it, and they can break that down, and they're going to incorporate that into the soil. So what you could do is you could lay the paper on top of the soil, and then put some leaves or something over the top, just so that you don't have to look at the newspaper or cardboard. When it comes to the newspaper, the only parts of the newspaper that you shouldn't use are the glossy parts. The colored print is no longer an issue, because they are using soil-based inks now. So even the newsprint is okay, and the dye is okay, because it's soil-based. I have worm bins, and the worms love, and the other microbes that are in the worm composting bins, they love newspaper. So, okay, so now so if you've got a raised bed that you've used before, I would recommend that you loosen the soil. And if you've got old dead plants in there from last year that you didn't remove, you can remove those, but try not to disturb too much of what you have out there. You don't want to rip it out and have, you know, too much of a tumult for the soil life that's in there. You can also just cut it off at the surface, and those roots should be broken down by the microbes. So you don't necessarily have to pull them out. I usually do, but I try and do it kind of gently. So you want to make room for your new plants. When you plant your new plants, if you're planting bedding plants, it's a little plant that's already got roots in it, then you're going to just use a little trowel, dig a little hole, and put your plant in, and then put the soil around it, pat it down, and now it's its new home. And so even if the soil around it's not totally loose, if you just loosen it right where you are putting that in. You can also, when you dig that hole, you can put a handful of compost in that soil. And just like with the, if you're starting with pots, you can add some rock dust and some azomite if you want to add some minerals to it. But other than the compost and some of those minerals, probably don't need to add other things, because once you can get your soil life more active, they are going to be bringing more of the nutrients from out and about. They're not limited to that little part around the plant. So they're going to go out about and bring nutrients and water to your plant. So after you put your plant in, then you're going to want to mulch around it, but don't put the mulch too close to the plant, because you don't want to, the plant needs to have its own little stem free in the air. And if you're planting seeds, then you need to, make a little row. You got to loosen it up just enough so that you can make a little line in your soil to plant your seeds, and then cover them up. And then once they come up, then mulch around them, but not too close around them. Now, if you have a garden bed that is already, like a square, you've got a 20 by 20 foot square out there, and you can't reach across it, then you have to walk in that bed. And it's best to avoid walking on the part that you want to plant, because you don't want it to be compact. You want it to be nice and loose, just because it needs to be nice and loose for the roots to grow. So you might want to consider treating that big square as a place to put permanent planting beds. And the old-fashioned way was just to make a row, one row, and then you'd have 2 or 3 feet in between, and then another row and 2 or 3 feet in between. And you can certainly do that and just walk in the paths. But more people are beginning to create a wider bed, maybe 30 inches wide, maybe 3 feet wide, but probably not wider than 3 feet. Some people make them 4 feet, but that's a little bit hard to reach into. The idea being that you stay on the outside of the bed, and you can reach into the bed to weed and to, plant and all of that. So you don't have to walk in it. So you could have these wider beds, maybe 30, 36 inch wide bed down your square, and then have maybe 18 inches that's going to be a path, and then another bed, and then however many of those, and you can make them as long as you want, because the idea is you can get into them from both sides. But that way, having the wider beds instead of just a single row, it kind of maximizes your growing area, and you can grow plants closer together, and you can do more interplanting. So like you might have some tall plants that take longer to grow, and then some shorter plants that, like, I'm going to give an example. So maybe you'll have broccoli that gets big, you know, it gets over 2 feet tall and it gets big, but it takes a while to get there. And then you may have things like radishes, which grow very fast. And like in a month, they're finished and you pull them up. So you can have these big plants growing like this, and they can't be too close together, maybe 1.5 to 2 feet apart. So you've got space between those and around those that you can put all these smaller things. And then by the time the broccoli plants get really big and bushy, you've got your little small plants out of there. And you could even do things like planting lettuce and other little salad greens around those broccoli plants, and then you'd harvest those before the broccoli gets too big and shades them out. That's kind of another topic, but I was just explaining why having the wider garden bed could be beneficial, because you can utilize that space more fully and plant more plants in that area than you could if it was just a row. Okay, let's see. So again, if you have a raised bed in a box or not in a box, or you just have a wide garden area, to refresh the soil, you're going to want to aerate it if you can with like a pitchfork or some kind of a fork, to poke it down in and kind of just rock it, loosen it like that, as opposed to tilling it. And then you also will want to add some compost, but it needs to be good compost. And I know you say, well, what's good compost? Probably if it comes in some kind of a bulk bag from Home Depot type place. I'm not, I buy a lot of supplies at Home Depot. I'm not knocking Home Depot, but what I'm saying is a lot of those kinds of products are not necessarily going to give you the quality of nutritious soil. Now, you could certainly buy your potting mixes there. You could buy perlite, vermiculite, those kinds of things there. That's not a problem. But when you get something like compost, it's nice if you can get a locally produced one, which has locally sourced microbes, because the whole point is to increase soil life when you buy compost. Compost is just organic material that's been broken down by the microbes, and there still is some organic matter in it, and there is also soil life in it. And if it's locally grown or locally produced, then it will have local microbes. And the microbes that live in our part of the world are not the same microbes that are living in Texas or, South America or something. So it's better to have local. Now, of course, making your own compost is a great idea, but that will certainly be a topic for another day. So I think this is enough to help you get started, just realizing that garden soil is not the same as potting mix. Potting mix actually doesn't actually have soil in it. It's got this peat moss or coconut coir in it, and garden soil is for an outside garden. So when you're looking at a store and you're looking at all those bags, the garden soil needs to go out in the garden. If you are ordering soil from, somebody's going to deliver soil to you for your garden, you need it to be garden soil. Topsoil probably isn't going to have enough soil life in it. It's just something that they probably scraped up along the side of a road when they were, building roads. So I would buy something that would be called garden soil, and the Susitna Organics compost place sells that as well. So, nobody wants to make things cost more than they need to, for sure. But on the other hand, skimping on soil is not the place to skimp, because if you don't have good soil, you are not going to have a good garden. And so good soil means good soil life and good soil texture. And if you have a garden that's already out there and it doesn't have good texture, the way to make it have good texture is not by tilling, it's by getting more soil life in there because the soil life is going to be, going throughout the soil and loosening it up. And so the soil life we need to feed with organic matter. And you can also feed it with actually inoculating it with more soil life with compost and things like compost tea. But I think the compost tea is going to be a topic for another talk, because right now we're just talking about getting started. What do I need? Well, you're going to need to have some soil or some potting mix to get started. And then how are we going to handle that throughout the summer? So I'm going to close this off. And for those of you who are with me live, we're now going to have a Q&A, but I am going to stop this recording. So those of you who are watching this online, I hope you have a great garden season. And the main thing is just get started. Thank you for joining me.